I grew up I was born in Essendon in Victoria, and went to school at a school called Aberfeldy School, which is near Essendon, till I was about 8. And then we moved to Parkdale, which is on the coast, about 15 miles from Melbourne. This was going from I was born in 1919, so during the 20s and the 30s, it was the Depression time, and it affected us as it affected most other people. And my dad was a shipping clerk, and he lost his job and was out of work for several years. And
so when you say shipping clerk, what did you do?
Well, he'd go on board ships as they came in and check what they were delivering into the port of Melbourne with all his bills of lading, or whatever they called them, and checked that they were right until he lost his job. And he was out of work for many years, and it was very depressing for him, because having 5 kids, his ego was, negative, poor bloke, and he was unhappy for Mum and the kids, although we never starved or anything. We had things like bread and milk for breakfast, or bread and dripping, which was a treat that we had after. We always had on Sundays roast lamb, and after Sundays we had the dripping from the lamb on toast in the morning. And so we had enough to eat, and during those years we were very happy. We were a happy very close family, and we'd usually take off to Gippsland, which is the area we went to. It was about 50 miles from Melbourne, and we went various ways, mostly by train, and were picked up by relatives in Gippsland and taken to their place, in a place called Levertush. And we stayed in one of the old cabins that are, sort of made of iron, very hot in the summer. But they were wonderful times, and that was Uncle Will's place, Uncle Will Proctor, and he had about 30 or 40 horses, most of which had never been ridden. And if you want a horse for a visitor, one of his sons, usually Horry, who was my favourite cousin, to go out and catch a horse and tie up its front leg and put a saddle on it and hop on it on a ploughed paddock and put spurs on, and put the spurs into the horse, and the horse, having the front leg tied up, would be fairly dispirited, and after a few minutes he'd get off and say, "She's broke," see, and give it to the visitor. But my dad was a wonderful horse rider. He was in the Boer War. He was born in 1883, and he was 17 when he went to the Boer War. He was his mother had a lot of money at that time, and he was going around the world with a tutor at the age of 17, and he, unknown to his family, joined the army, the Silikut, and went to the Boer War. And he was a dispatch rider. He'd have about, I think he told me, he usually had 3 horses if he was riding dispatches, and change horses as one would get tired, and keep the other 2 with him, and etc., etc. So he went to the Boer War, and he met among other things, he met Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, and he was a doctor at the war, and he had to examine my father once because there was something, he had fever or something. So Dad met the great author who wrote the history of 2 wars and all those novels and so on, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Anyway, the days at Parkdale, we stayed there until I was about 15. When I was 14, I left school. We all left school as soon as we possibly could because we couldn't afford, apart from any other reason, we couldn't afford to go on to schooling. So I got a job at the Melbourne University, sweeping floors for the metallurgy school at the Melbourne University. I got 15 shillings a week. I used to, later on in life, when I was earning good money in radio and television and so on, I sometimes make a commercial, for instance. The most money I made out of one commercial was about $20,000. And in the first year of my work, you know, this when I was getting 15 shillings a week, that's 3 pounds, 36 pounds a year, and I'd earn enough in one day for a lifetime, at that rate, or more so. Anyway, after that first year, I got a job at the Melbourne Herald as a copy boy, running copy, the obvious thing, and you know, a few years after that, in the years following that, I got odd jobs such as apple picking. I was apple picking for one season, and I went up to work on a dairy farm in just out of Longwarry, which is, as I say, about 50 miles from Melbourne, and helped in the dairy farm, just doing odd jobs and so on. I've forgotten. I think I got 10 shillings a week, and my keep, in other words, somewhere to sleep and food. I then I got another job in a soft furnishing wholesale firm in Flinders Lane for about a year until I finished that. And by the time went on, I was about 18, and a friend of mine was running a radio school in Melbourne called, it was just a radio school. He was teaching voice production and acting, radio acting. And he asked me to go to school, which I did. And I stayed with him for a while, and for about a year. And at the end of that year, I was helping him teach the other students. And that sort of got me interested. My brother, John, my older brother, John, he's 5 years older than me, was in radio too, and it was a friend of his that had this radio school. So I got interested in radio and acting, and I did some amateur theatrical shows in Melbourne for the New Theatre, which is a left-wing theatre. Did some very good plays, and also worked in amateur theatre, a chap called Gregan McMahon, who put on 8 amateur shows a year in Melbourne at the Comedy Theatre, which is one of the top theatres in Melbourne. And he had them on for a week at a time, and I did a couple of shows with him. And I'm making this very brief. Well, we can go back on anything, but a job came up. The war started, and 3DB Melbourne, which is one of the big commercial radio stations in Melbourne, one of their top announcers joined the army, and they were looking for someone to take his place. And the general manager of Josie Williamson's, who ran the Comedy Theatre among other theatres in Melbourne, had seen me in this Green McMahon show, and suggested to 3DB that I could do the job, although I hadn't done radio work. I'd done this radio school, but I hadn't done radio work before. So I got this job at 3DB. where I was a sort of feature and night announcer. I did the first hit parade in Australia. Well, I followed the bloke that went to the army, and variety shows and state announcing and this sort of thing. And that's how I got into radio. And then not long afterwards, anyone of my age had to go into the army for 3 months a year, and then eventually we were told it would be a good idea to join the army because we'd get benefits if we did, and if we didn't join the army we'd have to go in anyway and wouldn't get any benefits. So it was obvious, so I just joined the army, the AIF. And my brother Keith was a staff sergeant in charge of a hygiene unit which serviced a division. He did jobs like testing water and making sure that the water was pure, and if not, putting chloride of lime into it and delivering it to all the units. This one I went on for a year or two. We went up to New Guinea, having been in Australia for 6 months or so, and then finally went to New Guinea, and I went attached to an artillery unit. And about 2 or 3 months after I got there, a famous Australian musician who was by this time in charge of all entertainment for the army, Jim Davidson, the chap's name was, formed a unit which was half American and half Australian, and gathered people from all units in America, American units and Australian units, to form this 50-50 show. And I was with that until about 1945, and came back, and that disbanded. I went into another unit called the One Us Broadcast Control Unit because our commander, Field Marshal Sir Thomas Blamey, didn't like the Americans, and in particular didn't like Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of Southeast Asia, Australian and American troops, and didn't give the Australian troops credit for much, although they did a lot more than the American troops did. The American troops were pretty crook. So I was with that unit, One Us Broadcast Control Unit. We had some of the best writers in Australia, people like Sumner Locke Elliott, Ralph Peterson, Murray Chapman, Richard Davies and others, and we also had top actors, and we sent 12 or 13 war correspondents up to the front line, and they sent down stories about Australian incidents in the battles up there, and we would put them on the air. We'd sort of rewrite them. Our writers would rewrite them into radio form, and would put them on in radio form, which would be broadcast compulsorily over every station in Australia. We had several types of shows, including we used singers. We had our pick of the best singers. We used the ABC Symphony Orchestra and the ABC Wireless Chorus and the ABC Military Band, just to do our shows. We had was a pretty we put on pretty good shows. Anyway, that went on until I got out of the army. Oh no, that disbanded, and I spent a little more time before I was discharged in 1946, and then I left Melbourne and went to work in Sydney at the age of 26, doing radio parts, acting in radio serials and things. And over a period of time, I did thousands of radio shows, including episodes of serials and half-hour shows and hour shows and hour-and-a-half shows, etc. Acting and narrating and comparing. I did some light entertainment shows. I was lucky enough to be able to do a variety work, because I also did commercials, which paid pretty well. A lot of actors wouldn't do commercials, but beneath their dignity, these stupid coots, because that paid pretty well. But anyway, I did reasonably well until I did a play called Rusty Bugles, which was written by this son located I told you about. And we toured it for 2 years. So it was a very good play. And at the end of that, decided to go to England. Yvonne and I got married when I was 29. I had an agency, a theatrical agency, and Yvonne worked for this agency, and that's where I met her. And after, well, I suppose about a year, we got married. I was 29, she was 20, she had not quite 21. So, and when I was 31, 1951, we went to England. Where
What date were you married?
In 1959, 59.
What date?
No, 49, sorry, 49. March the 23rd. See, I remember.
In Sydney?
In Sydney, in one of the old churches there in King Street, the end of King Street. As a matter of fact, the day I got married, I was drinking at 5 o'clock in the afternoon with some of the blokes, because I think I must have been married at 5:30 or something. And they said, "Where are you going?" I said, "To get married." And they didn't believe me. Anyway, I went to the church and I looked up, and the word must have got around, because several of them were in the church by this time, including some models. I got to know quite a few models at that time. And they were at the back of the church looking on in amazement, because it looked as though I might never get married. Anyway, it happened because Yvonne put it to me one day. I just presumed that we'd get married, and she suddenly said that she was going to Wagga for a job. And I said, "You can't want to marry me then." She said, "But you really haven't asked me yet." So then I asked her, and then I had to go through the rigmarole of going to see her father, who was a businessman, very nice chap, and he insisted I see him in his office. And he was sitting one side of the desk, and I was, like a schoolboy, and he was saying, "Times are bad, you sure you can support her, etc., etc. You're an actor, and that's not a very good thing these days. You can't guarantee to make a living." I said, "No, you can't. It's impossible as a freelance actor." But I've done all that so far. Anyway, finally, he was okay, and got married. We got married, went to England in 1951, stayed there for 3 years, where I did stage work and film work, and a bit of radio work. The repertory work was most interesting, because it was you'd change weekly with a play. You'd open a play on Saturday night, and on Monday you'd read a new play. On Tuesday you'd do read it and mark it. In other words, mark the moves for the entire play. On Tuesday you'd do Act 1 without books, Wednesday Act 2 without books, Thursday the whole play without books, Friday the dress rehearsal, Saturday night we'd open it. So we'd do this every week, and it was a wonderful experience, and something I thought I'd never be able to do, learn all these lines, particularly with plays like Passing the Third Floor Back, in which I played the stranger, Jesus, and I never stopped talking, and I thought, I'll never learn this, but funny how it comes out if you concentrate on it enough. And I did it anyway. That was a wonderful experience, and I did a few films over there, not big parts, but the year...
Which films?
Carrington VC, Young Lovers, On Monday Next, which was sometimes called Curtain Up, with Robert Morley. Carrington VC was with David Niven and Margaret Leighton. On Monday next was Robert Morley, Margaret Rutherford, Lloyd Lamble, this chap that originally ran this radio school in Melbourne. Lloyd played one of the main parts in this Monday next. And then, it was during the performance of Carrington VC that the director of the film, whose name was Asquith, one of the famous family of Asquith, Lord Asquith, and I think he was Prime Minister in the teens. And he was a charming little man, and for some reason took a liking to me, and I did this small part in this character VC. When he offered me this part, he said, "I'm sorry, Deryck," he said, it was £100 a day, which was enormous money in those days, because Yvonne was earning about £6 a week, I think, and that was about a pretty good wage in those days. But when he offered me £100 a day, and then apologised because it wasn't a very big part, but I got 10 days out of it, which was just £1,000, which was out of the blue, and that was the week that we decided to come home. But during the week, one day I got a message to go down and see him, and he introduced me to a man that I'd never seen or heard of. His name was Jack Dunphy, and he said, "Deryck, I want you to meet Mr. Dunphy. He wants you to come and talk to him about going in with him. He's an agent." I went back and told the blokes in the dressing room, and I said, "You may, because Jack Dunphy is the biggest agent in the world. He doesn't take just actors, he only takes leading actors. And he doesn't apply to films and scripts to get actors work. They send him scripts for him to cast the leads, and that's how big he was." They said, "You may." But unfortunately, that was the week that we got on a ship and came home, because Yvonne was pregnant with Karen, about 6 or 7 months pregnant by that time, and she wanted to go home to the son and to her mother, and where I knew I could make a living in radio, so that was fine. So I'll never know whether I could have done all right in the film business or not. We came back to Australia, and before we left London, the managing London manager of J.C. Williamson's, the big Australian theatre company, asked me to go and see him, so I went to see him, and he gave me a copy of a script and told me to deliver it to the managing director of J.C. Williamson's when I got back to Melbourne. So we came back by ship, of course, and I got to Melbourne, went to see this Sir Frank Tate, the managing director, and gave him this script, and he said, "Oh, well, we want you to star in it. It's a show called The Pommy." Pommy means Englishman. So I said, "But I'm Australian." He said, "Yes, but you sound like an Englishman now, so you'll play the Pommy, young Pommy who." There's a story about this young bloke who came to Australia and worked in the outback, and some of the supporting players playing Australian parts were top-line English actors who were working in Australia at that time, stage actors. So it was a bit funny. Anyway, I was pretty nervous about doing this, because I was thrown into it when I first arrived. They'd already been rehearsing this show without the lead, and I was thrown into it. And everyone was waiting. Still hadn't had Karen, and I was worried about her, and I was worried about the part, and I was worried about being thrown into it, and it was all a bit too much for me. So I had what I suppose can be called almost a nervous breakdown. I go on stage and I'd try and speak, and nothing would come out, and I'd just take deep breaths, and it was a horrible thing. And I went to the they sent me, the Judge Williamson said to me to the theatrical doctor, and he said, "Pull yourself together, man." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You just be normal. You can't. I said, "Well, I'm sorry. I can't help it. It's just happened." And so I got out of that play, and my understudy took over. And by the way, we paid pretty well too. But I couldn't do it, and I couldn't do radio work. My nerve had just gone. My father-in-law, who was a cigarette distributor, had various vans distributing these cigarettes all over Sydney, offered me a job driving one of these trucks. And I never driven. I didn't even have a license, so I got a license and drove a truck for him for quite a while until 6 months or so, I suppose, until I felt better. And started back in radio, doing parts in radio, and got back into it again. And then from then on, I was okay. And I did mostly radio and stage and films, and then, of course, television came along, and I did a lot of television work. I was in the first of the television series made in Sydney, a thing called Autumn Affair, which was at Channel 7, and that was the first series. Didn't pay much, but in the years following I went into various series, some of which I played the leads. People Next Door and Silent Number and other things, and I did a lot of shows in Melbourne, because Melbourne were doing 4 or 5 regular shows, one mostly police shows. There was one called Homicide, one called Matlock, and one called Division 4, and I had regular parts in the 3 of these shows, usually baddies, but always the guest lead. And but I could be playing a priest or a dairy farmer or a policeman or whatever. Was very good. As a matter of fact, one week in Sydney, one of the Sydney newspapers commented that I was in the 3 Homicide, Division 4 and Matlock in the 1 week. And they said, haven't they got any other actors? They keep on putting them in these plays. It's just because I was good for that type of part and for a variety of parts. So I was lucky doing that. Now, do you want to go back on anything, or I just ramble on?
Well, we could. What about when you were a kid? What did your grandmother and grandfather do? Grandmothers and grandfathers.
Well, my grandmother was one of the most saintly little ladies. Mum? No, my mother's mother.
What was her name?
Clark, Nana Clark. I don't know what her Christian name was, but she was a wonderful little lady, and she always remembered all our birthdays and always baked a cake for all our birthdays. This was, of course, during the Depression, and it was wonderful to have a birthday cake on your birthday, because you didn't get much else. My grandfather, Pa Clark, was also a shipping clerk with the same firm where my dad worked, Bridgeford's, a firm called Bridgeford's. And my dad's mother, Nana Barnes, she was Irish. She was born in Killarney in Ireland. I never met her husband. He died before, or he either died or left her or whatever. I didn't know him anyway. And Nana Barnes, before we left the Essendon area, we were living in a house where Nana Barnes came to stay And she died she only stayed for a few weeks, and she died there. As a matter of fact, just before she died, she asked me to boil an egg for her, and which I did, a soft-boiled egg, and she said it was lovely. And my dad came in about half an hour later and told me that Nana had died. I don't think the egg killed her, but it was the last meal she had. But she was a very upright, very... I was about 8 or 9. And it was about that time when I was home by myself looking after Deryck Barnes. And the chimney caught fire in the kitchen. And I went and got the hose and hosed up the chimney to put it out. And I remember bits of soot falling on my face. But anyway, I should have just left it, but I didn't realize at the time. But they burned out anyway, but it just frightened me. It was about that time. And
what were your mum's and dad's names?
Mum's name was Evelyn Maud Barnes, and Dad's name was Joseph Henry Francis Barnes, which is he went to a Catholic school, St. Joseph's in Melbourne. And although he was a Catholic, I can't remember him ever going to church. Mum used to go to the Church of Christ in Parkdale, around the coast, and I used to go to Sunday school. She used to ask me to go to Sunday school.
Was that Catholic or...?
No, that was Protestant. So my grandmother, Nana Clark, was quite religious. She went to church all the time. She was a tiny little person, about 5 feet tall, but she was quite a good businesswoman. She ran a knitting factory and things like that. But, and she lived till the age of 96. Nana Barnes was a businesswoman too, and owned hotels, and she owned a ruby mine, and she owned quite a lot. But she was also a gambler, and she gambled the lot away. I've seen some pictures of some of the houses where they lived. They great mansions.
How old was she when she died?
She was only in her 80s, mid-80s. But Dad was only 76, I think. Mum was about the same when they died. Nana Clark was 96, and her brother, Uncle Will Proctor, he was 96 when he died, and all his sons were, in their 90s. And
was Will the one who was blind when he was riding the horse?
That's right, yes, when he was very old. He was in his 90s, and he'd still get on his horse every day. By this time he was living in Longwarry, and he'd go for a ride on his horse, because he knew the area backwards. And I remember Lil said to him, "You silly old bugger, Dad, you know you're blind." He says, "The horse can see." He was a wonderful, tough old character, and a randy old bugger too, because he was in his 80s, and he was visiting. My sister Ruth told me that he was visiting them in Melbourne, and chased her around the room. She was a very attractive girl. Bit frightening, the old bastard. But so he was very. He always had a cigarette butt in his mouth, and yet he didn't seem to smoke much. But I can never remember him without a cigarette butt hanging out of his on his horse. He'd be sitting there with his cigarette butt, this big old hat, rumpled hat, pulled down. My memory of him is mainly him sitting on a horse. But his own farm in Labbertush was just a ramshackles like the Egg and Eye, And but he managed. The German owned a farm next to his farm, and Uncle Will used to manage this German's farm very efficiently. I suppose because he was paid a wage and he couldn't make anything out of his own farm. All he had on his place was were horses. I can remember one day when I was about 12, I suppose. One Christmas we were up there, and they wanted to dehorn a bull which was been hurting other cows and horses and things, and so they had to catch this bull to dehorn him, and they had about 10 blokes on horses after this bull, going miles after mile over fences, and they finally got this poor thing and got it into this crush where it couldn't move, and started to dehorn it, and they got through one horn all right, and then they started the other one, and the dehorner broke, so then they had to saw it through, and this poor old bull, which is enormously big and strong, staggered, and they finally let him out. He was all right, but I mean, it was a horrifying thing to watch, and it was.
Because it bleeds a lot, doesn't it?
Oh, the blood spurted out like a tap, from each horn as they took it off. Some of the memories there that I had of there were something that I suppose you never see again, because Uncle Will also managed a sawmill up in the hills beyond his farm. His farm was the last on the road, and the next, and the Bourbon Mountains were behind him, and he had this sawmill up there somewhere. I never went to see it, but they used to load these logs onto this train, and it had wooden rails going for about 10 miles from Longwarry, hauled by draft horses, about 10 or 15 draft horses. And the sight of the draft horses plodding through the bush, pulling all these logs to Longwarry, which must have taken a couple of hours, I suppose, was something that I remember with fond memories. Our childhood was pretty happy, particularly the times up in Gippsland at usually my uncle's place, and at other times we hired houses in various areas. One time we were caught in a big bushfire one Christmas, and I must have been about Ruth was a baby, and Bill was 4 years younger than me, but must have been a little kid, so I must have been 6 or 7. And this bushfire came, and Horry Proctor came to make sure that we were all right, and the fires were all around us. And he took us through where the fires had been. They were all sort of smouldering and black, and I was barefooted. And I remember I had to carry Bill, my young brother, who's 4 years younger than me, on piggyback him through the fire, to safety. And when we got back, and the house was saved, Horry saved the house where we were staying. We were renting this house. And there was an old bloke not far from us, who was a dear old bloke, whose name was Faulkner, I remember, and before this fire he'd made us a little wooden train sort of thing with the wooden wheels and so on. But poor old Mr. Faulkner's house went. That was a pretty frightening time. Bushfires are really horrifying. You can't, if you're in the way and there's a big wind, there's no way you can get away from them. And quite a few people were burnt at that time, and of course there were lots of other fires later on, just as big or bigger. Pardon?
What about your brothers and sister?
Well, my brother John was 5 years older than me. He was the eldest, and he all his life was in radio, either announcing, or he was studio manager of 2UW, or he managed another radio station. And after he left radio, he also wrote a bit. He wrote a bit of radio stuff, and so did his wife Margaret. Her name was Margaret O'Brien. and she was a good writer. And when after Jack left, he did various things, working with advertising agencies, and he was secretary of Actors Equity for a few years. My brother Keith, who was 2 years younger than me, he was the so-called clever one of the family. Very, very cheeky. And he also got into radio and was announcing, and but he finished up mainly as a manager of country radio stations until he retired. And my brother Bill also was in radio with country stations. He finished up in Alice Springs, managing the station there and also announcing. My sister Ruth, who was the youngest of the family of the boys and girls, she didn't go into radio, but she did some bit of stage work. She had a little sweet little singing voice. Was a very attractive girl, and she also did. She worked with St Vincent de Paul in Melbourne, and was very popular there with people because it's a wonderful charitable organisation. She married Jack married Margaret O'Brien. Keith married a Catholic girl called Reen and had 7 children. My brother John had adopted one child who, and then she became, because they thought Margaret couldn't become pregnant, but as soon as they adopted this child, she became pregnant and had another child called Biffy, David his name was. But Peter, the adopted child, became a very big time, and he's still in New York. And if he's not a millionaire many times over, I'd be very surprised. He went over to New York with Gray's Advertising and finished up as president, not of Gray's Advertising. He left Gray's and went to another agency and was president of the company, which was very rare in advertising agencies in America. And he got write-ups in the New York Times and so on because of his being very unusual, someone from overseas being manager. He was very tall. He's 6'4" and very big man, and very ruthless manager apparently. That's why he was so successful apparently. Anyway, we haven't seen much of him over the years. Biffy, his young brother, who was at school quite brilliant but never did anything, didn't want to do anything, and he married a girl who suffers from multiple sclerosis, and he's been looking after her for several years now because she's unable to do anything for herself. She's in a wheelchair and she can't do anything. Toys. A wonderful bloke, Biffy. Keith.
Yeah, go
on. Keith had 7 children. Bill married an Anglo-Indian girl, Hazel, who and he had 4 children. She died, unfortunately, in her 40s, which shattered him. Ruth married. She was married twice. The first marriage didn't last too long. She didn't realize at the time that the man she married was a homosexual and wasn't very interested in marriage or anything else, and so that broke up. And she married a Sri Lankan who was Deryck Barnes, who was one of the nicest blokes I've ever met in my life, and they were extremely happy. For the last 6 or 8 years of his life, he was seriously ill. He had heart bypasses. The first one I think was 4, the next one 3. He had 3, and then 2 or something, and then he was supposed to have another one, but the doctor said he wouldn't be able to take it, so he lasted another couple of years and then unfortunately died. that he's the only person I watched die. I was down there at the time and went to the hospital, and Ruth was told to come in, and we all went in. She, her adopted daughter, Yvonne, and myself went in and actually watched him die, poor little bloke. That shattered Ruth, because they were as close as any two people I've ever met in my life. That nearly finished her, but she's a lovely girl, Ruth, and very brave. And her health hasn't been too good the last few years. They had to adopt a child. They had no children. I adopted one. So that was the family. What else?
What are some of the funniest stories from the war?
Funny stories.
Interesting. Happened.
Well, one of the most unfunny stories happened to my brother Keith, because unlike me, when in New Guinea, I was in this 50-50 army show, which we had a 70-piece band. It was built on the Glenn Miller style band, and we used to do a lot of Glenn Miller stuff, and we had 6 female impersonators doing dancing and so on, and all that sort of thing. It was a very, very good show, very big show. There's 70 altogether in the outfit. John McCallum was in it. He became quite a well-known film actor. And Ralph Peterson and others who did well after the war and had done well before the war. But Keith was still he was staff sergeant with this hygiene outfit, and he'd have to go through New Guinea by himself to a site where a unit was to come to, and he'd have to go there to make sure that they camped on the right at the right spot. He'd choose the spot, and he'd check the water and mosquitoes. Because mosquitoes were more problem. Malaria was more problem than anything else up there. And so Keith really had it pretty tough, because he'd have to go close to the Japanese and so on. But his nasty experience, he came home on leave to Melbourne, to normality, after being with this outfit in the middle of this terrible fighting in New Guinea. And he went home on leave and went back to New Guinea, and they did basic training and so on, which drove them mad. But one of the blokes in his tent, a friend of his, couldn't take it. He couldn't take the fact that they were back into this terrible environment, and he took out a revolver in front of my brother Keith and shot himself. And that obviously badly affected Keith, and he had to go to hospital because it shattered him for a while. So he never talks about it, and I've never asked him about it, but Keith Smith, who was a well-known broadcaster, met him at that time in New Guinea, and Keith went to visit him in hospital. And it's in a book that I've got that Keith Smith wrote about the war, mentioning this. Or he doesn't mention Keith's name. He just says, a friend of mine, Sergeant K.B., and explained what had happened to him. But I still haven't ever talked to Keith about it, and he's never offered to talk about it, and I don't think he would to anyone, I imagine. But his family are very successful. All his kids are very successful, possibly because they all went to Catholic schools and had a very good education. None of the family, as far as I know, except my daughter Karen, have university degrees. Keith had a son who was going to university and was a very brilliant boy, brilliant athlete, brilliant scholar. suffered from schizophrenia, and at the age, it hit him at the age of 18, I think, while he was going to university. I think he took some LSD or something, which probably triggered it, and he's been having to be looked after ever since. My brother Keith still can't leave Melbourne without making sure that Kevin is looked after by someone down there. And he's under medication, of course. And incidentally, I must ring Keith to see how he is, because he's just been to a Warrnambool hospital to have a special treatment for a week, and then a continuation for 6 or 8 weeks, which apparently has had wonderful results. And so I must ring Keith to find out how Kevin is. I'll be up.
What about during the time in New Guinea? Some of the things that happened there when what you saying that the Americans were very
they were very lazy.
Scared of the
were
coming over and stuff?
Well, if the Japanese bombers came over, they'd be so high you could hardly see them. And we'd have you'd have a yellow alert if they were anywhere within the area, and we'd have a red alert if they were immediately above us. Well, I don't think we ever had a red alert, but all the Americans in the 50-50 show dug big slit trenches, and if there was an alert, they'd dive into these trenches so fast. The Australians stood around because the possibility of a bomb coming down would be 1 in a billion. It was a very hilly country, and it would virtually have to be a direct hit to do any damage. There's one experience I had that I just forgot. That before I went to the 50-50 show, I was up on the Owen Stanley doing a stunt, and I was in this tent. Oh, not a tent, it was a native hut, sleeping there, and I was with the unit doctor and me and a couple of others, ambulance blokes, and one day I did see these jet planes above, miles up. You could just see them, and like birds that you could hardly see run right up in the sky, about 30 or 40 of them, with American fighter planes going in and out of these bombers. You could just see them, you couldn't even hear them. And extraordinary to watch, and suddenly I heard this swish, 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 and a bomb exploded about 50 yards away, and it just went straight up. Just dirt went straight up in the air. No problem at all, no danger at all. But I didn't realise at the time that this hut that we were in was full of ammunition, apart from us sleeping there. So if it had come where it hit us, we would have been too bad. But I mean, that's, as I say, a chance in a billion. That was the hut. I can remember waking up in the middle of the night with rats eating my hair, just chewing away. That was more horrifying than anything else. We had, where we camped near Port Moresby, we had a couple of American Negroes who were homosexual, and they were doing big business there with other American Negroes who'd come in, and sort of, you'd come into your tent and say, "Do you all tell us where Johnny Johnson's tent is, or Stephanie's tent?" And they'd go and do business with Johnny and Stephanie. And I think Johnny and Stephanie made quite a lot of money in those days, at that time. The commander of our 50-50 show was a bloke called Jim Davison, put together. This chap called Phil Lewis was the commander of the unit. And he came one day with his revolver and put some of these blokes out. Just to order them out, otherwise he would have shot them.
About when they, didn't you say when a gun went off, something in the theatre, everybody
Oh, yeah, that was watching a film once. A couple of us, I think Ralph Peterson and myself, went to watch this film. The Americans used to have these films all the time. They had big shows all the time. Oh no, this was a stage UFO. They had entertainers on the stage. And there were about 10,000 Americans watching this, and we were right up at the back because we weren't supposed to be there anyway. But on stage, part of this act, a revolver went off, and it was like a wave of this American mob in front of us was so petrified that it was like a wave, them running. Then for about 30 seconds until they realized that nothing was happening. They were extraordinary. Well, they didn't want to be in the war, and I don't blame them. And I mean, they'd have chocolate and ice cream, and they had officers' messes which were bigger than any nightclubs in Sydney, and they had aeroplanes flying down to Australia and bringing back grog all the time for the officers, the American officers. And the GIs had floorboards and mosquito nets and showers and wonderful food and ice cream and chocolate, and they're all fat and unfit. But that's what they wanted. As I say, they didn't want to be in the war, and they insisted on being treated like this, otherwise too bad. And the Australian soldiers, equivalent to the infantry, would be, I remember one time this happened, and the army show was staying with this American unit. We were sleeping on these beds and floorboards and electric light in the tents and all this sort of stuff and showers. And the unit next to them was an Australian infantry unit. They were living in two-man tents, weren't sleeping on the ground, and their food was bully beef and biscuits, and they were very fit. But one of the problems was that they couldn't get enough ammunition. The Americans could bring up this grog, but Australians couldn't get ammunition. It was a farce, the whole thing. My army career. What else do you want to know?
What some stories about your mum and dad?
Well,
interesting things can you?
Well, Mum and Dad, when we were in Parkdale, bought a horse and jinker and sold eggs and Western-style butter, which is very good butter. And they got together regular clients and used to sell this eggs and butter to them every week. It was very brave, It was hard to do anything like that because it was depression. Not many people could afford to buy things like that, but Dad and Mum did this, and Dad was so down, I remember he said he used to go into Melbourne to see whether there was a couple of days' work, as a shipping clerk, because there wasn't much shipping going on. And he said he'll sing Happy Days Are Here Again if he came home. He sang Happy Days Are Here Again if he got a job, which he did on one occasion. And he was so happy, the poor bloke, coming home singing Happy Days Are Here Again. It must have been a terrible thing for him to go through, and my mum. Didn't seem to affect us much, the kids, because as I say, we always had something to eat, and the beach was only half a mile away, and we used to go down there swimming and so on after school.
You were a bit of a roughie at school, weren't you?
No, I wasn't a roughie. I was a bit of a loner. I suppose because we were poor and so on, and I think it worried me a bit. And I remember there's a girl who smacked my sister Ruth across the face. And she's a big, rough girl, and I went over and smacked her across the face and told her not to do it again. And the headmaster had me up and said, you shouldn't hit a girl. And I said, if she hits my sister again, I'll hit her again. And I got along pretty well with the headmaster, so that was okay. I got into a couple of fights, but I mean, that would only be once because I was a pretty good fighter, apparently, and so that the kids would steer clear of me after that. I wasn't a bully or anything, but I wasn't. I just wasn't going to be put down by these kids. Later on, I had a cousin, Deryck Barnes, who was a professional fighter and a very good one. He fought some of the best in the world and beat them. He wanted me to be a fighter because he said I could have been. And I used to train with him. He was a fireman too, the fighting fireman. And I did some training with him for about 6 months or so, but I wasn't in the slightest interested in going into to be a fighter. I didn't want to be hurt. I didn't want to hurt anyone. So that was the finish of that fighting career. I did some foil work, swordsmanship, and I liked doing that. That was quite good fun for a while because I was fast and so on. Well, as far as athlete, I used to be able to run all right and jump and all that sort of stuff. I was lucky. So I did all right athletically at school, and for the state championships and so on. But Dad was always he was a wonderful sprinter and a magnificent horseman. He finished up in the Boer War teaching the New South Wales light horse. He used to teach them to ride. He was also what they used to call in those days a gentleman rider. He'd ride in races as an amateur, and mostly hurdles and steeplechases. This was at the turn of the century. But and he was very strong. He was only a small man, about 5'9", I suppose, but he was exceptionally strong. He could hold my arm with two fingers, that's the forefinger and the middle finger. He could hold my arm. Had very strong hands, I suppose, because of his riding. I don't know, but anyway, he had this extraordinary strong arm. He's also during the World War won the British Empire, I suppose it was, pistol championship. So he had a very good eye. Playing quoits, for instance, where you throw quoits from about eight feet or something over this peg. 6 quoits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I've seen him go up to 500 or 600 before he missed. He'd go click, 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 click. He just had this wonderful coordination and wonderful eye. Same thing with billiards and things like that, Wonderful eye. I remember one time he told me he trained some bloke at Bridgeford. This is before the Depression, before he lost his job, for the annual sprint championships, and he took this bloke off cigarettes, took all his cigarettes, and pocketed them, and said, "You can't smoke if I'm training you." So Dad smoked him himself, and the day of the race, he said this bloke was coming on pretty well. I'm very happy with the way Dad was training him. And it was a handicap race, and Dad was on scratch. And this bloke was given about 10 yards start in 100 yards. Dad beat him very easily. And this bloke was most annoyed because Dad didn't tell him that he was going to be in this race that he was training him for. Another time at Bridgeford's, one day they were talking about people with psychic powers, and Dad told him about meeting Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was said to be psychic. And this bloke said, "Oh, Conan Doyle's a fool. I know more about the psychic matters than Conan Doyle." And Dad said, "Oh, a terrible fool. He wrote the history of 2 wars and etc., etc., etc." And he said, "As far as this is concerned, he's a fool." He said, "I know more." He said, "I can see my mother right now standing next to my chair." And Dad said, "Well, get up and give the old lady a seat." Yeah, funny incidents, but you can only remember them. I can't just think of them off the bat like this. I did in brief, as far as acting is concerned, I did about 20-odd thousand radio shows. That's in various types, episodes, half hours, and so on. 8 years on stage, 12 feature films, several television series in which I played either the lead or co-lead, apart from the hundreds of episodes I did with Homicide Division 4, Matlock and those things.
No, Skippy too.
Oh yeah, and Skippy and things like that. But what else did I do? Stage, films, radio, television. Yeah, that's it. So I made a reasonable amount, reasonable living over the period. I did 6 years at the music hall in Sydney because I needed the money. Also, while I was doing that, I'd do odd radio shows and so on, and commercials and things. No, and then we left Sydney to go to live at Sunny Corner because we were sick of the rat race, and although we had a nice house in Sydney, we had our own swimming pool, and that's where Richard learned to swim, and he turned out to be an immediate success, mainly because we got this pool. But although it was a nice house and nice pool, new house and nice garden, nice pool, we decided to get out of the rat race and go to live at Sunny Corner, which is in the country, between Bathurst and Lithgow, about 100-odd miles from Sydney, where we built our own house, literally built our own house, and 3 little cabins and Yvonne's pottery shed, or building it was, including kiln and another place which was a sort of a garage come place to display and sell pottery. We got to the stage where Yvonne made our own concrete bricks with the help, I can remember, of Richard at one period. So that was a period we spent 20 years living there. We bought a health food store in Bathurst and ran that for 12 months. And then I left there. Yvonne built the business up tremendously in that time and made quite a big profit after 12 months when we sold the place. And I got a job as a promotions officer with a development corporation, which was supposed to build a new city between Bathurst and Orange, and we bought lots of land there. I mean, the corporation bought lots of land, thousands of acres, to build this new city, and then the governments decided not to go ahead with, so we had to sell it back to the people for less than we bought for it. And so that I did that for, I think, from 1976 to 81, so that's about 5 years. Then after that, I went back and did television work. Well, the homicides, Division 4s and all that sort of stuff. And then
you have to say why you stopped as well when we got the health food store was because you had the big scare thing when you got on the plane. Oh, and in
oh, it was
series down in Sydney, didn't you?
I was going, yeah, well, yeah, I got
your pseudo heart attack.
Oh, it's well, I was supposed, but we went down to do a series in Sydney. First of all, we went down to do a series called The People Next Door, in which I played the lead. We did that for 6 months, and Richard went to a school down. Well, Richard and Karen, I think, had left school by this time and was going to art college. And then I think she got her first job at the Boulevard Hotel. When I did The Silent Number, which is, but I did People Next Door. We went down to live in Sydney for that time because it was too demanding to go back and forth to do that particular show. So we rented a place down there and let someone stay in our house. And while these so-called friends stayed in our house in Sunny Corner, they wrecked the place. That's beside the point. And I got into another series called Silent Number, and Richard used to come down there occasionally with me, and because I stayed at the Boulevard Hotel, which is a very top-class hotel. We got, it was good to stay there and get all the food chucked in, apart from the money that you got. I got the part in Silent Number because when they showed the show, when they were selling the show to Channel 9, the bloke that ran Channel 9, who was an old bastard called Packer, Sir Frank Packer, said that he'd only do the show if I were not only in it, but told the rest of the cast how to speak. Because he was as rough as diamonds, this Packer bloke. But he objected to the way that they had Australian accents. They didn't at all, of course, and I didn't presume to try and tell them how to speak. But that was rather funny, and it was during that show that I had a funny feeling one day, and they raced me off to the St Vincent's Hospital. And one of the blokes in the cast had several heart attacks himself, and he said, "Oh, you're having a heart attack." So off I went to St Vincent's, and they did various tests, and after several hours they said, "There's nothing wrong with you. It's a psychological thing." So I ran back to the studio. It was only a couple of miles, and told them I was all right. But anyway, I left the show because it was one of these nervous things again. So I got out of that show and went back to Sunny Corner. That might have been when we brought.
And then you were getting on the plane to go.
Oh yes. Oh, then I started to do shows again. Homicide Division 4, and I had to fly from Bathurst to Sydney, and then from Sydney to Melbourne. And I got on this Fokker friendship because I said, "Yes, it's okay. I'm all right now." And I got the script and I got on the plane, and they closed the doors. And I started to move, and I told them to stop. And I said, "I'm getting out." And they said, "You can't get out. The door's closed." I said, "I'm getting out." So finally they realized I was serious. And by this time, I think Karen had driven me to the airport. By this time they'd gone home, of course. Well, it's about 20 miles from where we lived. And I got out, and I think I must have got a cab and went home and said, "It's happening again. Must have driven Mum mad." However, it turned me off flying for a while, except that Richard, not long afterwards, started to learn to fly. And he said to me one day that he was going up with this slightly bigger plane with the instructor, and asked me to go with him, and I hadn't the thought of flying, was like I couldn't do it. But Yvonne said, "Go with your son, go with your son." So I went with Richard and went up in it. And he was at the controls, flying over Sunny Corner, and I was even leaning out, looking at where we lived and so on. Not sure whether we had a camera or not. But anyway, I was quite okay at that time. I trusted Richard completely. Silly boy. And but I was okay after that for flying. I've never liked heights. I can't stand being near a drop. Even driving near one. There's a road near us where we live now, called the Goat Track, and it's got a drop of must be about 800 to 1,000 feet on one side of the road, and if you go the other side, there's the mountain. You can't go through the rock. But I couldn't drive down there. I did by accident once, and never again.